Instead, the war upended the Middle East, plunged Iraq into chaos, killed hundreds of thousands there, and led directly to the rise of ISIS. We'll examine that legacy later in the program. But first, America's hubris, then, is being flung back in its face now by new global challengers. Vladimir Putin, intent on crushing Ukraine's democracy, and China's Xi Jinping, who sees a new world order being made more in Beijing's image. Today, the two come together in Moscow. Beijing is casting this visit as a journey of peace. But is it more like the rise of the authoritarians? Vladimir Milov, former Russian Deputy Minister of Energy, is joining me from Vilnius in Lithuania. And Michael Beckley, former Pentagon official and co-author of Danger Zone, The Coming Conflict with China, joins me from New York. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. So I sort of laid out a thesis, and I want to ask you first then, Vladimir, what you think Russia, Vladimir Putin, gets from this visit at this time.
Great to be with you, Christian. I don't think they will get very much because I'm pretty sure that China is absolutely unhappy with how the war is going, that Putin is not capable of winning, and that he actually entered this protracted and bloody conflict. On the contrary, I'm sure he promised Xi Jinping last year that this will be just a swift blitzkrieg type operation. Now it is messy, and moreover, China has no influence over it. They cannot make any decisions that would change the course of a war. However, Putin is a very important ally in Xi Jinping's standoff against the democratic West. He needs him. So somehow he has to show some support and bring probably some help, which is why I would say this is a very uneasy relationship behind the facade.
And Michael Beckley, from a former US government perspective, and because, you know, you've written this book on the coming conflict with China, what do you think Xi Jinping gets out of this?
Well, I think we have to look at this in the context that China believes that it's locked in a long-term confrontation with the United States. And in that context, Russia is a vital ally. It's really China's only great power ally. It supplies, obviously, resources to China. Xi is probably hoping to get military technology. China is trying to modernize its nuclear-powered submarines, which currently are very noisy. They also want to get surface-to-air missiles. And more broadly, as Vladimir pointed out, both of these countries are revisionist powers. They are trying to upend the status quo. They're trying to redraw the map of Eurasia and to push back at what they view as a Western, democratically dominated world. And so in that context, Russia is a vital ally for China. So it's no surprise that China will continue to prop up Russia, even as it tries to create a facade of being the even-handed peacemaker. So
to that point, as we said, they are, casting this as a journey of peace. Let us just play what Xi Jinping said during his meeting. Here's a little bit of what he said.
It is true that both of our countries share the same or similar goals. We have exerted efforts for the prosperity of our respective countries. We can cooperate and work together to achieve our goals.
So that was more about, what you've just been talking about. Who do you think needs the other most, Vladimir?
Well, definitely Russia. Russia is in deep crisis, and there are a lot of troubles on the battlefield, in the economy, and so on. And China is not participating again, as I said, in this mess. So clearly Putin needs Xi Jinping's support more. However, as we both pointed out, for China, it's important that they keep this strategic ally. Sometimes I think it's also very useful that Putin really creates some disturbing positions which are taking a lot of American resources, Western resources. So maybe for China also somehow this situation is kind of useful. But definitely it is Russia with its, emerging economic crisis, budget crisis, with Russia running out of ammunition at the battlefield. It is Russia which needs China most.
Mm-hmm. And Michael Beckley, again, just to dial deeper into this, you said Xi looks at a generational sort of struggle, being locked in a long-term struggle with the United States. So in his letter to the Russian media before his visit, he said that the two countries will, quote, jointly adopt a new vision, a new blueprint, and new measures for the growth of China-Russia comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination in the years to come. So what would that look like?
They're clearly sketching out an alternative world order where, first of all, sovereignty, what goes on within their borders, how they treat their own people is their business, and the United States and its allies need to stay out of that business. And second, that great powers should have natural spheres of influence, that basically the countries around them should be reduced to vassal status, and that's just the way that international politics works, and that we all just have to adjust to that reality. So they're clearly sketching out that alternative, and they also jointly push back at what they call a Cold War mindset or blocs, so namely U.S. military alliances, as well as the use of sanctions, which obviously have been used to great effect in this war. So trying to push back at that world order and carve out space for another one dominated by them.
Vladimir, you are particularly, you're a former Deputy Minister of Energy, and you're very, very, plugged into the economy of Russia. Can you just sketch out, because we hear in the media so many different things. On the one hand, the sanctions are really hurting. On the other hand, they're not, and the projected growth is bigger than we might have expected. Can you just give us, from your perspective, having been, in the room where it happens, what it looks like in Russia now for Putin?
Sanctions are having a very deep and profound impact. We are just plunging into a very deep budgetary crisis. During the first 2 months of this year, the deficit of the Russian federal budget had comprised 90% of the total deficit that was planned for the whole of this year. And this is because of the European Union oil embargo and price caps working. On top of that, you have major industries collapsing, being unplugged from capital markets and Western technologies and so on. We have domestic retail trade in deep depression. Last year, the contraction was more than 10% on an annual basis. Well, I can go on for a long time. Point is that sanctions are having increasing impact as time goes by. So it's not an immediate thing. And right now, this year would be particularly vulnerable for Putin because government is running out of money. This is actually when he's needing Chinese support the most. So far, I have to say, it's been relatively thin. So China is providing something at the bare minimum, actually, to make Russia hold on. But they are not like throwing their full weight to save Putin also economically.
So let's just delve a little bit deeper into this. Do you all, you sort of addressed it at the beginning, do you all believe that actually Xi has anything constructive to offer regarding peace? This is what Putin said to China about China's peace proposal, which Xi says he's bringing to Moscow. Here's what Putin said.
We have carefully studied your proposals for resolving the acute crisis in Ukraine. Of course, we will have the opportunity to discuss this issue. We know that you proceed from the principle of justice and observance of the fundamental provisions of international law, indivisible security for all parties. You are also aware that we are always open to the negotiation process. We will certainly discuss all these issues, including your initiative.
Michael Beckley, should those involved, like including the West that's supporting Ukraine, take any comfort from that? Is there any serious avenue towards any kind of resolution?
No, unfortunately, I think we're at the point where the only comfort that can be taken are things that maybe Xi won't do coming out of this meeting. So hopefully he won't make an explicit pledge, for example, of lethal aid for Russia. Hopefully he'll reiterate his sort of bland one-liners about not wanting this conflict to escalate to nuclear war, just to put some doubt in the back of Putin's mind that he could really count on China if he escalates severely in the conflict. But other than that, I agree with Vladimir that China obviously would have wanted Russia to win this war easily. But I think a longer drawn-out conflict is not necessarily a terrible outcome for China either, because it ties down the West and causes the United States and its allies to expend their own stocks of munitions and distracts them from whatever China's trying to do in East Asia. And so while it might have preferred a Russian victory, keeping this war going is not the worst thing for China. And so I just don't expect China to make productive, proactive measures to actually bring this conflict to an end on anything other than Russia's total terms.
And Vladimir, keeping this war going, is that a good thing for Russia? On the one hand, we know that Putin always thinks that time is on his side and a gradual, attrition and wearing down, not just on the battlefield, but in the supporting nations. Is time on Putin's side?
I think this is, again, one more major mistake and miscalculation by Putin. His permanent belief in his resource supremacy, that time is on his side and he can outlast and outweigh the democratic Western societies, which will soon, confront fatigue of this war and so on. This is wrong. This is wrong, and this is a profound miscalculation. And I think this is also what makes Chinese very uneasy, because they are not in control of the outcome of this war. And this is, I'm sure, what worries Xi Jinping, and this is something that prevents him for throwing his full weight in terms of backing Putin.
I want to ask you both now to just tell me what you think and what you felt when you saw Putin, A, being indicted, or at least a arrest warrant being issued for him by the International Criminal Court on Friday, and then spending the weekend hopping into occupied territories, including on the mainland of Ukraine at Mariupol. What do you, I mean, that's, it's serious chutzpah. What do you think, Vladimir?
Well, this indictment, I don't even think I know that it actually sent shockwaves among my former colleagues in the Russian government, because all this talk about Putin being persecuted somewhere, somehow, had finally transformed into a very, very specific arrest warrant. And we all know what happened with many leaders who have been indicted previously. So this is like a major qualitative step forward, moving on to formally indicting him. I think Putin's snap visit to Crimea and Mariupol was an emotional reaction to that. It was a show of defiance. He wanted to show that he doesn't care, and what I grabbed is mine, and you will not be able to change this with your arrest warrants. Also, in a show of strength, attempted show of strength for the Russian elite. But I'm sure this also demonstrates this, emotional reaction of this visit. This also demonstrates the vulnerability that they understand that, in terms of lengthy strategic confrontation, there are really very rarely chances that Russia might win.
And Michael, he did this, on the eve of Xi Jinping's visit. Was he trying to project strength to China as well?
Yeah, I think he's just trying to show he can act with impunity. And it made me a bit sick to my stomach. It's sort of like seeing a criminal cavorting around the scene of the crime. And I think it's unnerving for a couple of reasons. One, now the stakes have really been raised, because Putin, is going to have trouble traveling outside of Russia for the foreseeable future, now that he's been accused of war crimes. And so that may increase his potential to escalate. And I think it also says something about China and Xi Jinping, that he would be willing to have this state visit and these friendly relations with Putin so soon after the optics of Putin going around and then being accused of war crimes. So it says scary things, I think, about both Russia and China going forward. Yeah,
I was wondering about that too. And of course, the United States, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has addressed not just Putin's, arrest warrant and his visit to Mariupol, but also this visit between the two of them now. This is what Blinken has just said about it.
That President Xi is traveling to Russia days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for President Putin suggests that China feels no responsibility to hold the Kremlin accountable for the atrocities committed in Ukraine, and instead of even condemning them, it would rather provide diplomatic cover for Russia to continue to commit those very crimes.
So is that, do you think, what he's doing, Michael, providing diplomatic cover?
I think that's exactly what he's doing, because when it's not just that he's meeting, they are reiterating the message that this war is the West's and principally the United States' fault for expanding NATO, for infringing on their rightful spheres of influence. And so it's just showing that they have a united front and are trying to shift the blame and make it look like they are the actors of peace, and that they were forced into this conflict by the animosity shown by the United States and its allies.
So let's use our remaining minutes just to project forward then. Vladimir, from where you sit, First of all, you talked about your former colleagues in government. Are you getting any feedback from people who are still there and in the Putin circle? And where do you think this is going for the Kremlin-backed operation?
I think my guess is that nobody in the circle surrounding Putin actually likes what's going on. Everybody more or less understands that whatever time and resources the continuing war might take, Russia already lost it. But Russian elite is extremely incapacitated and fearful. They are being watched and monitored by security services day and night. They are afraid of even talking to each other about their defiance of Putin's policies. So you don't have to expect anything from them, except maybe, which I hope will finally work, some sort of sabotage or Italian strike. Like, they will not really enthusiastically invest themselves into Putin's cause. And we see a lot of things in Russia are slowly but surely collapsing. Maybe it's also the result of that behavior.
Mm-hmm. And Michael Beckley, again, you're focused on the title of your book, The Coming Conflict. Where do you think Xi sees the path to whatever he's trying to do? I mean, President Biden says maybe he'll try to have a phone call, maybe reestablish some kind of contact. Where do you see this going between Xi and the United States?
Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to go anywhere good anytime in the next 5 to 10 years. At this point, the United States and China have clearly shown that they have severe conflicts of interest. They basically espouse clashing visions of international order. And then they also have, of course, a territorial conflict in the shape of Taiwan, which has been heating up. And while we've been so focused on Ukraine, and rightly so, China has been conducting even larger shows of force in the Taiwan Strait. And with elections coming up in both Taiwan and the United States, I expect on the American side there to be a fair amount of hostility shown towards China. So it's going to be a very combustible mix in that context. And then with obviously a hot war going on in Europe, I just don't see any avenue for a real thawing in U.S.-China relations.
Gosh, it's all very dark, isn't it? Michael Beckley, Vladimir Milov, thank you so much indeed for joining us.
I'm Dr. Sanjay Gupta. This week on Chasing Life,
the average teen is like living so much of their lives in the digital world on social media.
That's Professor Kenesha Sinclair McBride. Her entire job is treating adolescents' mental health. She's a licensed clinical psychologist at Boston Children's Hospital.
And so much of this is impacting their mental health.
Listen to Chasing Life on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or your favorite podcast app.
Be My Guest with Ina Garten is back for a third season. On this season of Be My Guest, Ina talks to Stanley Tucci, Nora Jones, Misty Copeland, and Laura Linney. Here's Ina to tell you more about the show.
Hi, I'm Ina Garten, the Barefoot Contessa. When friends come to visit, of course I want them to have something delicious to eat. But what's also important to me is the conversation. It's the glue that binds us together, how we take care of one another. I've invited some really interesting people to visit me, to come to my barn in East Hampton. We'll share stories that will hopefully amuse and inspire you. And you're invited too. Hope you'll join us wherever you get your podcasts.
And as we said, of course, all of this 20 years after the Iraq War that upended so much about international relations and the rule of law. Of course, the real cost of the war in Iraq can be counted in lives lost, especially in Iraq. The suffering of the Iraqi people grew greater as the insurgency grew stronger. And that all began shortly after the invasion. I witnessed a little part of those beginnings while reporting on a U.S. military nighttime raid in Baghdad.
Adrenaline pumping, a company of soldiers from the 82nd Airborne starts house-to-house raids. Acting on intelligence flushed out by the bombing phase of Operation Iron Hammer, they are after the leader of one of the guerrilla cells that's been attacking them. Let them search the house, screams one woman. It's midnight and everyone's asleep on the floor. This young woman protects her newborn. Miraculously, soldiers avoid stepping on it.
I remember that so well, the harrowing experience of so many Iraqis. Now, Ghaith Abdul Ahad is an Iraqi journalist who watched as his country was torn apart, first by the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein and then by the US-led occupation. His new book, A Stranger in Your Own City, paints a tragic picture of a country that has been destroyed by war. And he's joining me now here in the studio. Ghaith, welcome to the program. You saw that. You were there when those... I'm sure you actually accompanied maybe some Western journalists watching that happen on a regular basis. So for people who don't remember, how did that kind of attack on Iraqi civilians set the process and sow the seeds for this backlash against the American occupation?
I mean, there was a moment, there was an hour, I call it an hour of freedom, when the dictatorship fell, before the Americans entered the streets. And in that hour, when suddenly all the security forces of Saddam melted and disappeared, and the Iraqis were, I would say, everyone was excited to get rid of Saddam. But when they saw the Americans, they were expecting, I mean, it's a Faustian deal. No one wanted a war. We've been bombed by the Americans before. We've seen war with Iran. But they thought, fine, if this will get rid of Saddam, let's go through the motions. And of course, no one asked the Iraqis if they want a war or nothing. But then you realize early on the attitude of the American soldiers towards the Iraqi civilians. I remember the first time I was driving with a friend, and why are they pointing their guns at us? And of course, these are how occupation armies behave, because they see threat everywhere, while civilians were expecting something else.
Yeah, I remember those days. So, I mean, they thought they were going after militants, but as you could see, they were going into houses full of civilians. And I remember being terrified that they were going to step on that baby in that house. And I just wonder, I think you were 5 years old when Iraq, your country, invaded Iran. And that, led to so much of this. You include all of that in your book. Why do you go as far back as the Iraq War and Iran?
Because in 2003, after 2003, there was this kind of very binary, easy way to look at Iraq. Sunni, Shia, conflict, Kurds and Arabs. And I wanted to talk about Iraq as we saw it. When I was a child, during the Iran-Iraq war, I thought Saddam was a manifestation of God, because I have seen nothing. His pictures are everywhere. People talk about him. People fear him. And this is how we understood this Iraq. And Saddam kind of portrayed himself as this manifestation of the glory of all these history stuff and replaying the history again and again. And that was our understanding of history. And of course, the war in Iran led to the war of Kuwait, led to the sanctions which destroyed the Iraqi people, 13 years of very severe sanctions. Come 2003, Iraq is a broken nation. It's barely standing, it's barely functioning. And then suddenly we are told that this whole narrative of 5,000 years of civilization is not true, It's a new narrative. Now it's a very sectarian narrative based on a system we call muhasasa in Arabic, in which each sect will take a number of ministries. And that sectarian rhetoric that came after the war, after the occupation, thanks to exiled politicians who were in London and Tehran, that was the first step in the sectarian civil war that followed.
So that's really interesting, because you explain, when you would go out with journalists and you'd be translating, I guess, for the Western journalists who you were working for. What would some of their first questions be to whichever Iraqi they were interviewing?
So the first time I was asked to translate this question, we were seeing a family in some kind of suburbs of Baghdad, and the journalist asked me to ask them, are they Sunnis or Shia? And it was a shock for me the first few times. Sometimes I didn't translate that question, because it's a very crass question to ask in a modern middle-class society. That I don't want to say that Sunnis and Shia did not exist in Iran. I'm just saying the sectarian political identity did not exist. It was something imposed on the Iraqis. So I was shocked. Why do I talk about Iraq in the 80s? Because I want to say that in my high school, we were 40 students or 42. Till today, I don't know half of them if they were Sunnis and Shia. And that is very, very important to highlight. But of course, within 1 year, I myself started looking at the Iraqis within this whole sectarian frame, and I started identifying Sunnis and Shia. It took me many, many years to come out of that mentality.
But it's lasted to this day. That is the legacy of this war, right?
Of course, the legacy of this war, I mean, there are two legacies. There is the political legacy. There are the same political parties, half of them, run militias, half of them, everyone is corrupt. The Iraqi government is one of the most corrupt in the world. That is one legacy of the war. But then there's a new legacy, which is the young generation that came out after 2003. In 2019, 2020, we saw this massive pouring of the youth into the street. And they were a trans-sectarian, pan-sectarian, generation fed up with this political narrative that imposed on them since 2003.
I know, I was going to say, it goes, I suppose, to the heart of, you called your book Stranger in My Own City, in My Own Country. What do you mean exactly by that?
I mean, Christian, imagine yourself growing in a city, never leaving it for 28 years, which was my case in Iraq. It's a very flat city, it's a very open city. It's, I would say sometimes it's an ugly and boring city too. But that was my city, and I knew it, and I walked in it, and I, grew up in it. And then within 2 years of the war, I myself cannot travel throughout Baghdad without having someone to vouch for me. So I remember that moment in, I think, 2006 or 7, when I just woke up in my bed and I realized this is not my city anymore. I am a stranger in this city that I need I need to change my ID cards, I need contacts in every single street so that I can just move. And that's not only me as a journalist, that's the life of so many, of all the Iraqis who were trapped in this civil war.
I want to focus a little bit on what I think many Americans may not fully realize. And we were obviously reporting it throughout the years since the invasion. Of course, thousands of Americans and others, British and others, were grievously wounded in the many years of the occupation. There were the IEDs, that was a new thing, blew people up. They had catastrophic injuries. Journalists as well. Somewhere in the region of 4,000 Americans. But it was hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, and they are still suffering from burn pit exposure and all sorts of stuff. Were you aware of that level of Iraqi suffering when you were, being a journalist there during this period?
Of course, all what we saw the Iraqi suffering. I mean, of course, the Americans suffered, the soldiers were injured and were killed. But what we saw as Iraqis, we saw the suffering of the Iraqis themselves. And of course, the Americans left in 2009, stopped fighting in the street. But the Iraqis continued to die, and die in a more horrific numbers thanks to the emergence of ISIS, the Islamic State, and all the repercussions. And they're still dying till today. 2 weeks ago, I was in Baghdad, and I was hanging out with this guy, writing about him. And he's a militia commander, and he is responsible for killing thousands of Iraqis. And 20 years later, there is no accountability. None of the people who plotted the war, who led the war, who executed the war, the commanders, foreign and Iraqis, who killed civilians. There's no accountability. 20 years. And this is the problem for Iraqis, When you ask them about America now, they would just point at this corrupt political system that we have, and they blame America for bringing that. And without holding people accountable, not putting them in jail, but just opening being honest to the Iraqi people and talking to them.
I was, kind of shocked, but maybe I shouldn't have been, listening to quite a lot of the reportage that's going on right now in this 20th anniversary. Certain people, ordinary people in the street saying, in a way, we miss Saddam Hussein, not because we loved him, not because he was a good leader, he was a despot and a tyrant, but at least there was order.
This is the disaster. 20 years later, what this war has achieved, and the sectarian killing and the massacres in the street created this nostalgia for the strong man. And I mean, of course, all the dictators, you were just talking about it, all the dictators benefit from that illusion that it is the strong man who would stop a civil war, would lead. And that's the disaster. Another disaster of this war, apart from the sectarian killing, is, of course, the whole idea of democracy has been tainted in Iraq. Because when you go to the young generation and tell them a parliament, tell them election, they say, those kind of corrupt people sitting in the green zone. That is another victim of the invasion and the occupation, 20 years later, people are yearning for a strong man, and that is horrible.
That is a terrible legacy. And I wonder, in your book, you talk about some of the images that you saw on the day of, what was it? Liberation? I don't know. When the Americans finally got to Baghdad. You describe it in great detail, and you describe watching a U.S. Marine. We all watched it, basically helped tear down a statue and put the American flag up. And you write, no, you can't be doing this, I gasped. At least allow the facade of liberation to last for a day. But no, with all the arrogance of every occupying soldier throughout history, he covered the face of the defeated dictator with the flag of his victorious nation, briefly, but long enough to seal the fate of the invasion in the eyes of many. You then called it perhaps an honest act. I remember the officials in Washington were horrified and tried to, send the message to stop that, get that flag off, because this wasn't about America, it was about Iraq. Talk about, again, that moment.
This is why I think he was very honest, because for that Marine, he did not believe in all this rhetoric coming from Washington, all what the people were talking about. He saw it as a war between his army, his soldiers, and the Iraqis. And probably, if all the rhetoric that was coming around the invasion, the rhetoric of liberation and Iraqi prosperity and whatnot, that act of the Marine, covering the face of Saddam with his American flag, as horrible as it was on TV, it was a very honest act. That is a dictator we topple. It is not the Iraqis who toppled this statue. And this is another sad thing, Even the act of bringing down the statue was not done by the Iraqis, was done by American Marines.
And then it was quite clear to those of us who were, nose to the ground, that there was an insurgency growing and that it sort of started with the complete lack of control and lack of awareness and admission by the US that there was an insurgency, and the first manifestations were of looting and all of that kind of stuff. Were you concerned, and where did you think it would lead at that time in 2003, 2004? Did you think it would ever lead to ISIS in the end?
Maybe no one could have imagined ISIS as it is, but it was obvious that the Americans had no security plan, and the borders were open, and anyone who had a grievance against the Americans would come to Iraq to fight. That includes the jihadis coming as far as Afghanistan, Somalia, but also the Iranians who were working very hard to make the Americans. Why would the Americans succeed in Iraq and we are next? We should make the Americans fail in Iraq. So all these different forces, but also, again, the sectarian rhetoric of the political powers that came because Saddam was a Sunni, then by association, all the Sunnis must be guilty of Saddam's atrocities, pushing them into a corner, using the de-Baathification as a way to torment the Sunni community. Of course, they will take a rejectionist position towards the government, and these are the recipes of a civil war.
Again, as I said, Bush and his government were basically saying, in so many words, democracy in the Middle East will go through Baghdad. And that you heard, Bush saying that this is going to be a great, watershed moment. Could it have been any different? Because there are many people who say that even though the invasion was based on a lie about WMD, that a post-war plan that was coherent and credible might have made the best out of a terrible situation. Do you believe that or not?
For a few months, probably a year, I thought of that. I thought if only the Americans would do so and so, if only they would fix the services, maybe the people would. And a decade later, I realized you cannot bomb a nation, put it under sanction for 13 years, bomb it again, and come with this very clumsy plan and tell it to become a democracy. There was no way to turn an illegal occupation into a democracy. It was bound to fail. This is history. We're talking about another illegal invasion taking place at the moment.
Russia into Ukraine.
There is no legitimacy to that. Whatever Putin can say now, he will never, create any legitimacy to his